You know what's wild about the 70s? Hollywood was pumping out these dark, nihilistic thrillers that audiences completely rejected, critics dismissed as pretentious garbage, and studios buried faster than disco. But here's the thing. Time has a funny way of turning box office disasters into masterpieces, and these 8 films prove that sometimes being ahead of your time means getting punched in the face by it. Farewell, My Lovely should have been Robert Mitchum's triumphant return to noir, but instead it became a masterclass in how to revive a dead genre at exactly the wrong moment. Philip Marlowe, played by Mitchum in peak world-weary form, gets hired by hulking ex-con Moose Malloy to track down his lost love Velma in 1941 Los Angeles. Which sounds simple until you realize that Velma has reinvented herself as the wealthy Helen Grail, and Marlowe's about to stumble into a web of blackmail, murder, and betrayal that makes his usual cases look like parking tickets. What's fascinating is how this production became a battleground between old Hollywood and the new rating system that had just replaced the old production code, with director Dick Richards trying to inject genuine adult content into classic noir, while censors freaked out about the heroin addiction, prostitution, and brutal violence that Chandler's source material demanded. Behind the scenes, Mitchum was reportedly driving everyone insane with his refusal to rehearse scenes, changing dialogue on the spot, and generally treating the whole thing like an elaborate practical joke, which actually worked because his casual indifference to the mounting chaos perfectly captured Marlowe's jaded worldview. The real drama happened when networks started chopping up the film for television, stripping out the brothel sequences and drug-induced hallucinations that were essential to the story's nightmare logic, creating a sanitized version that completely missed the point of why anyone wanted to remake Raymond Chandler in the first place. What started as a prestige project ended up as late-night VHS cult gold, with collectors hunting down uncut Embassy Pictures tapes like they contained state secrets, proving that sometimes the best way to find your audience is to wait 20 years for them to discover you at 3 in the morning. Sorcerer proves that William Friedkin's biggest enemy wasn't the unstable nitroglycerin his characters were hauling through the jungle, it was his own maniacal perfectionism and really bad timing. 4 desperate fugitives accept a suicide mission to truck sweating dynamite across 200 miles of war-torn Central American jungle to extinguish a blazing oil well. And honestly, the fact that anyone survived this production is more miraculous than the story itself. Because Friedkin was basically running his own suicide mission behind the camera, demanding real stunts with real explosives in an actual hurricane, while his cast and crew slowly lost their minds in the Dominican rainforest. Talk about method filmmaking. Friedkin made his actors endure months of rock slides, muddy floods, and hostile locals, then forced them to drive actual trucks across a genuinely collapsing rope bridge during a storm that should have shut down production. All while studio executives watched their budgets explode like the nitroglycerin everyone was so worried about. The production chaos was legendary even by 70s standards, with multiple injuries, destroyed vehicles, and crew walkouts that made Apocalypse Now look like a weekend camping trip. But the real tragedy was the timing, because this masterpiece of existential dread had the misfortune of opening the same weekend as some little space opera called Star Wars, which meant audiences chose hope over nihilism, and Friedkin's brutal meditation on fate got trampled by lightsabers and Death Stars. What's even more insane is how completely the film vanished, becoming this mythical lost masterpiece that you could only find through underground VHS trading circles and midnight university screenings, where film students would whisper about missing scenes and rights issues like they were discussing forbidden religious texts. The moral panic didn't help either, with politicians and parent groups losing their minds over the film's unrelenting bleakness and total lack of redemption, essentially proving that audiences in 1977 weren't ready for a movie that suggested maybe the good guys don't win, and maybe survival isn't worth the cost, which is probably why it took 40 years for critics to admit that Friedkin had created an absolute masterpiece of despair. Phantom of the Paradise should have been Brian De Palma's breakout masterpiece, but instead, it became the most spectacular musical flop of the 70s. Which is saying something considering this was the decade that gave us disco. Winslow Leach gets his Faustian cantata stolen by the satanic record mogul Swan, gets framed for drug dealing, has his face crushed in a record press, and returns as the masked phantom to haunt Swan's new rock palace, while trying to save his muse Phoenix from the music industry machine that destroyed him. And honestly, the fact that this plot sounds completely insane is probably why audiences stayed away in droves, despite it being a brilliant satire of everything wrong with 70s pop culture. What makes this production absolutely bonkers is that De Palma was literally putting his actors in mortal danger for the sake of authenticity, with William Finley getting his face actually crushed in a working record press at a toy factory, where the foam padding couldn't stop the hydraulic power, and the mechanism started closing faster than expected, leaving Finley seconds from severe injury, and his scream of terror completely genuine on film. Behind the scenes, the movie was being sabotaged by its own studio, with Fox marketing it as a generic rock musical instead of the savage industry satire it actually was, completely missing the point of a film that was basically predicting how corporations would turn music into soulless product designed to manipulate and consume young talent. The censorship battles were equally insane, with the fictional Death Records label getting legally challenged by Led Zeppelin's actual Swan Song Records, forcing distributors to literally scratch out the logo in TV broadcasts and home video releases, which meant the film's most biting commentary about predatory music executives was being censored by actual predatory music executives. Talk about life imitating art. Here was a movie about how the music industry destroys artists getting destroyed by the music industry, and it only found its audience through midnight screenings and bootleg VHS tapes, proving that sometimes the only way to appreciate a film about selling your soul is to discover it in the underground where souls still matter. The Long Goodbye proves that Robert Altman's biggest mistake was trying to update Raymond Chandler for the 70s by making Philip Marlowe a mumbling, ineffective loser, which sounds like a terrible idea until you realize it was actually brilliant social commentary that audiences completely rejected. Elliot Gould's Marlowe drives his friend Terry Lennox to Tijuana as a favor, only to discover that Terry murdered his wife and faked his own death to manipulate Marlowe into being his unwitting accomplice, leading to a climactic confrontation where Marlowe finally kills Terry and walks away playing harmonica, essentially destroying the myth of the noble private eye for a generation that wasn't ready to admit their heroes were dead. What's fascinating about this production is how Altman was deliberately sabotaging everything audiences expected from a detective story, letting scenes meander for minutes, while Gould improvised dialogue, and Sterling Hayden struggled with real alcoholism that made his performances feel genuinely unhinged, creating this dreamlike atmosphere that critics dismissed as pretentious, but actually captured the disorientation of trying to solve crimes in a city where nothing meant what it seemed. The studio battles were legendary, with executives panicking over test screenings where audiences hated Gould's unconventional Marlowe and Altman's refusal to deliver clear answers or traditional action sequences, leading to a marketing campaign that promised classic detective thrills and delivered existential despair instead. The censorship for television was particularly devastating, with ABC literally cutting out Marlowe's final act of violence against Terry, which completely destroyed the film's moral reckoning and turned it into just another meandering character study instead of the savage indictment of lost loyalty it was meant to be. Here was a movie about how the old codes of honor were dead in modern America, and the network censors proved the point by refusing to let audiences see what happens when those codes finally collapse, leaving behind a sanitized version that missed the entire reason Altman made the film in the first place. Capricorn One is what happens when you take America's post-Watergate paranoia, throw in some fake moon landing conspiracy theories, and somehow convince Hollywood to fund the most expensive "what if the government is lying about everything" movie ever made. 3 astronauts get pulled off their Mars mission at the last second because the life support system is broken, but instead of canceling the launch, NASA decides to fake the entire thing in a desert studio while the empty rocket flies into space, which sounds completely insane, until you remember this came out in 1978, when Americans were already convinced their government was lying about literally everything. What makes this production absolutely wild is that director Peter Hames was basically making a documentary about his own paranoia while simultaneously creating the exact kind of elaborate hoax his movie was warning people about, with the cast performing fake space scenes that were so convincing they actually fueled real conspiracy theories for decades. The stunt work was genuinely terrifying, with real helicopters chasing a real biplane through actual canyons at insanely low altitudes, and when the biplane actually collided with one of the helicopters during filming, the crew just kept shooting because apparently near-death experiences were just part of the creative process in the 70s. Talk about method filmmaking. Here was a movie about fake government operations being made with genuinely dangerous real operations that could have killed the entire cast. The moral panic was incredible, with politicians actually accusing the film of undermining NASA and feeding conspiracy theories, while NASA issued official statements denying they would ever fake a space mission, essentially proving the movie's point about how paranoid and defensive institutions get when you suggest they might be lying. What's even more insane is how the film became a cult classic through VHS rentals and late-night cable, with conspiracy theorists treating it like a documentary and using bootleg copies as evidence that the moon landing was fake, which means a fictional thriller accidentally became source material for one of America's most persistent conspiracy theories. Marathon Man proves that sometimes the most terrifying movie villains are just elderly dentists with a grudge, and honestly, Laurence Olivier's Nazi war criminal, Dr. Sell, asking, "Is it safe?" while drilling into Dustin Hoffman's teeth is probably responsible for more dental anxiety than every root canal horror story combined. Graduate student Babe Levy gets dragged into international espionage when his secret agent brother gets killed, and suddenly he's being tortured by a former concentration camp dentist who's trying to recover stolen diamonds, which sounds like the setup for the world's most traumatic dental appointment. What's fascinating about this production is how the torture became real when Dustin Hoffman, being peak 70s method actor, actually stayed awake for 3 days straight and ran actual marathons to look genuinely exhausted and terrorized, leading to the legendary story of Laurence Olivier telling him, "Try acting, dear boy," when Hoffman explained his extreme preparation methods, The censorship battles were brutal, with the British slapping it with an X rating and censors around the world chopping out the dental torture scenes, which completely missed the point, because the horror wasn't just the violence, it was the psychological terror of not knowing who to trust when everyone around you was lying. Behind the scenes, the psychological pressure was so intense that cast and crew were genuinely rattled by filming the torture sequences with Olivier's gentle demeanor between takes, creating this bizarre contrast with his character's icy sadism that made everyone question what was real and what was performance. The moral panic was predictable but intense, with parents groups losing their minds over the combination of Holocaust trauma and 70s paranoia, essentially arguing that audiences weren't ready for a movie that suggested maybe the good guys don't always win, and maybe surviving horrible experiences doesn't make you stronger, just more damaged. Here was a film about how trauma follows you forever and trust is a luxury you can't afford, and critics were mad that it didn't offer easy answers or comfortable resolution, proving that sometimes the most honest movies are the ones that leave you feeling worse about the world than when you started watching. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia is what happens when Sam Peckinpah decides to make a movie about his own self-destructive spiral and somehow convinces Warren Oates to carry around an actual severed head for 2 hours while everything falls apart around them. Benny, a washed-up American piano player in Mexico, learns that his girlfriend's ex-lover Alfredo Garcia is already dead and buried, so he figures he can dig up the corpse, chop off the head, and collect the $1 million bounty some crime lord is offering. Which sounds like the worst get-rich-quick scheme in cinema history, until you realize it actually works for about 5 minutes before everyone starts shooting each other. What makes this production absolutely unhinged is that Peckinpah was basically documenting his own alcoholic breakdown while filming in Mexico, with cast and crew getting into actual fistfights during breaks, and Warren Oates channeling Peckinpah's own self-loathing into a performance that feels less like acting and more like therapy conducted at gunpoint. The violence was so extreme that Sweden straight up banned the movie, while censors in other countries chopped out entire sequences of Benny's revenge spree, essentially turning a nihilistic masterpiece about masculine failure into a confusing mess that made no emotional sense. Behind the scenes, the chaos was legendary even by Peckinpah standards, with drunken actors stumbling through dangerous stunts in uncontrolled locations, where actual bystanders got injured during fight scenes, because apparently safety protocols were for sellouts who didn't understand true art. Talk about method filmmaking taken to its logical extreme. Here was a movie about a man destroying himself for money being made by people who were literally destroying themselves for money. And the fact that it flopped commercially just proved that audiences weren't ready for a film that suggested maybe the American dream was actually a nightmare where decent people turn into monsters for cash. The cult following it developed through grimy VHS copies and midnight screenings felt appropriate, because this was a movie that could only be appreciated by people who understood that sometimes the most honest stories are the ones that leave you feeling completely hopeless about human nature. Winter Kills proves that sometimes reality is so insane that fiction can't keep up, and honestly, the fact that this JFK assassination satire was financed by actual mobsters who may have murdered the producers mid-production is either the most incredible coincidence in film history or proof that we're living in the dumbest timeline possible. Nick Keegan investigates the assassination of his president brother and uncovers a conspiracy that leads straight back to his own family, essentially turning the Kennedy assassination into a dark comedy about how power corrupts everything it touches. Which sounds like a brilliant premise until you realize the production was being infiltrated by the exact same kind of shadowy figures the movie was satirizing. What makes this absolutely bonkers is that director William Richard was getting financing from mysterious sources who paid cast members with suitcases full of cash, while key producers kept turning up dead under suspicious circumstances, and the FBI was apparently investigating everyone involved, creating a situation where the paranoid political thriller was being made by people who were genuinely paranoid about actual political conspiracies. The production chaos was so extreme that filming got shut down multiple times when checks bounced and legal threats materialized, with Jeff Bridges describing being followed by intimidating advisors who seemed more interested in protecting investments than making movies, essentially turning the set into the kind of nightmare scenario the script was warning audiences about. Behind the scenes, footage kept disappearing when studios seized reels during legal battles, creating a situation where the movie about cover-ups was being covered up by the very institutions it was criticizing. And for decades, fans whispered about missing scenes and alternate versions that may or may not have actually existed. The film barely got released because of all the legal chaos, but found its audience through underground VHS trading and late-night cable broadcasts, where conspiracy theorists treated it like a documentary rather than satire, proving that sometimes the most effective way to expose the truth is to make it so ridiculous that people assume it has to be fiction.